Greetings, members, one and all of the Salivation Nation. We have with us Lior Gantz from Wealth Research Group with us here again to discuss some of the important topics that we are seeing that will have an effect on precious metals, monetary policy, recession, war. We're going to talk about it all here. Welcome, Lior.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
First, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on with the war in Ukraine. Many people have predicted energy prices would dramatically rise over this winter because of what's going on there. But we are seeing Germany start to take in natural gas now. We are seeing a mild winter in Europe. So the predictions for very high heating oil cost in the northeast of the United States and in Europe have not really played out. But there is something coming soon that many people think is going to happen probably in May. Do you want to speak a little bit to that and how that will affect prices, inflation, and gold and silver?
Sure. For one, I just came back from Europe. It is a really mild winter that they're having. Having said that, the reason that they were able to meet their energy needs is because they've exhausted all of their reserves, or a significant amount of the reserves. So the real trouble is potentially going to happen in the next winter. So they're not over the hurdle at all, and they have to figure out what to do, because now that Nord Stream is out of the question and natural gas from Russia is out of the question as well, you're dealing basically with how do you source either LNG, which is liquefied natural gas from the United States, and that requires a whole new set of infrastructure on how to receive it. I can talk a little bit about it, but in general, you need to create the infrastructure, and the Europeans have done some miracles as to how to receive these tankers that carry the liquefied natural gas. They are also looking for new sources of oil. And that's a really dramatic shift that's still not talked about. And if I can, in 1 minute, just elaborate on that. For many, many years, the Europeans, since the late 60s, they've mostly relied on Russia for their energy needs. Now, a lot of oil can be found in northern Africa, between Algeria and the other countries like Egypt, etc. These new sources will now come into play for countries like Italy, Spain, Greece. Greece can be from Turkey. So you're talking about a whole new set of geopolitical relationships that will soon be really important. And we haven't seen those in 50, 60 years. So between France is one of the only countries that's reliant on nuclear, but for these other countries, they are really in a distressed situation, and they must solve it by next winter. So that's really important to keep in mind. The real crisis is yet to come. They've been able to shove it another year forward, but next winter will be a disaster if they don't solve these oil issues real quick. And we will see Europe going back to coal. So this whole green energy movement towards wind and solar, etc., that is being really pushed aside as of right now. Secondly, you talked about May. I do want to address that. From everything we're seeing on the ground in the Ukraine, and from everything we know from history, Russia has never backed down from a war unless they had at least 500,000 casualties. They're not near that amount. As a country, historically, psychologically, only at 500,000 casualties, if they started to consider other solutions or other, I would say, structures to how to get what they want. A country like Russia historically has been invaded 50 times. And so for the Russians, if they can't secure these access points to their historical lands, they cannot stop. and they will not stop. So in May, they are right now enlisting hundreds of thousands of new soldiers from any way, shape, or form that they can. And May is important because the mud season is over, it dries up, and you can move soldiers, and obviously the temperatures are much milder. From the other side, from the Ukrainian side, they have been able to train on NATO weapons for months and months, and you will now see NATO weapons coming into the Ukraine. So we are going to face a huge battle come May. But in the bigger picture, here's how this all plays out. One, Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, for that matter, were huge exporters of potash, fertilizer, oil, natural gas, steel, aluminum, titanium. These are going to be both agricultural, energy, and metal supplies that are going to come off the market. So when you talk about inflation, when you talk about gold, silver, the price of the dollar, the stability of the global economy, these are all critical components that have basically been taken off of the supply. And this is even before we talk about sanctions. So as this ramps up in May, I think that the potential for a recession, the potential for the hard landing is going to become much more visible. And that's where I think we should start to really consider how this will play out. If the Russians are able to advance, that will give them a lot of confidence to try and continue into Poland or Romania or both. So that's on the Russian side. If the Ukrainians are able to withstand the blows, then now Russia gets desperate, and that's when you can start to bring the conversation of tactical nukes back into the picture. So in between May and July, you're talking about two very, very volatile months for the global economy in general and for Europe in particular. And I think that is a reason for many institutions, governments, and individuals to look into gold. And at the same time, I think that is another key catalyst for the Fed to pause interest rate hikes, which is also a huge bullish catalyst for gold and very bearish for the dollar. So as we get into those months, I think that's when you're going to see a lot of changes when it comes to war, recession, inflation, shortages in key commodities, and the price of precious metals.
And that's going to disrupt supply chain, which is just going to exacerbate this inflation and recession globally. And that is going to be the key driver that could send a weaker dollar, especially with you have the BRICS nations trying to declare independence. They're already declaring independence in many cases from the dollar. And so weaker dollar, higher gold and silver prices, it's a powder keg, essentially, it sounds like, as we head into later in the year here. And then we have the presidential election coming up next year, and who knows what could happen after winter, as you described there. Looking beyond what we just talked about here, they're planning something, the World Economic Forum. They've been very transparent on what they want to do there. You know, the old saying, you will own nothing and you will be happy. But a lot of this is also with regards to these ESG components, and all of that's going to be tied into a central bank digital currency. Let's talk a little bit about that. What are you seeing there in the development of that? Some people say it could come as soon as 2030. What are your thoughts on central bank digital currencies?
So I've put months of research into central bank digital currencies, basically covering all countries and all projects, all central banks from A to Z. The reason I say that is because I've made 2 special reports for your viewers, which they can check out at wealthresearchgroup.com/CBDC. And the second one is /CBDC2, the number 2. If you download and read both of them, you will 100% know everything that's going on right now with central bank digital currencies across all continents and all countries. I think that the key takeaway from this research is that CBDCs are coming. Almost 90% of central banks are testing them, piloting them, be it small scale or large scale. In China, for example, the pilot is already on 130 million people. The key questions that are surfacing is, one, will CBDCs be commercial or retail? And that's a key question. What do I mean by that? A commercial central bank, a commercial digital currency, means that it's a digital currency that is transacted between the central banks and the commercial banks. In other words, you and I, as the retail publics, we do not get to transact in those CBDCs. The second form of CBDCs is a retail CBDC. And from everything that I've gathered so far, the central banks do not feel like a retail CBDC is the right way to go. At least for now, they are completely not ready to roll out any form of retail CBDC. So I think that the first countries that will start transacting in CBDCs are going to be commercial, which means that it will not interfere with the way most people do business, and the central bank will leave it to the banks, to the JP Morgans, the Wells Fargos, etc., to see how they integrate CBDCs into their own systems and roll them out to the public. That's one. Two, it looks right now as if the developed nations, be it Europe or the United States, are taking it far slower than China, which really wants to start implementing it, and the African countries, which are basically trying to bring more people into the world's banking system. Those regions that are very connected, because China is putting a lot of money into investments into Africa, those two regions seem to be the ones that are leading the charge forward on CBDCs for now. Now, keep in mind, Africa has 54 nations, the fastest growing demographics in the world, moving from third world into 5G, leaping the entire industrial revolution. And many people are not going to even have bank accounts. They will have phones and they will bank through their phone. So when you look at how the 21st century is shaping up in terms of digitalization of central banks, it will probably be China that leads in this, but obviously the Europeans and the Americans will not stay far behind. It's just that there are so many problems with implementing this, be it the scalability of the blockchain, be it privacy issues, security issues, trust issues, and all of the other threats with cyber, etc. So what you see from the central banks is the true fear that they will roll these out and fail. And as you know, especially with fiat currencies, failure in a matter of trust of the public is the key fear of every government. If you lose the trust of the public, the fiat currency immediately devalues, and it can even be devalued into oblivion. Trust is what basically runs credit. They will not look to risk that. And so you will see a very gradual progress in this matter. I don't see the threat of central banks being unleashed or rolled out in the wrong way in America, for example, at least under this president. And then let's see what the next president and the next Fed does. But for the moment, I think that you can study this subject really in depth and be very prepared for the day that they start rolling out.
I think it's very important for people to understand that, yes, it's going to be a slow rollout. And I like that you have broken it down between commercial and retail. It may give us a little bit of a pause or a sigh of relief that it's not going to be implemented on the retail side, at least as of yet. But as we know, just like with artificial intelligence and all the technology, it seems to be moving towards the avenue of larger control, larger governance of our transactions. If you read the memo or the presidential directive that Biden put out to study central bank digital currencies and to launch that pilot, it was about governance. It was about environmental and social measures. And so when you look into that and you look at it from the commercial side, there are problems and issues and benefits depending on which side of the fence you fall on. But when you take that to the retail side, with all of these central banks that we talked about, JP Morgan gives them at least some flexibility with how they want to implement that, correct? So could, in a sense, JP Morgan say, well, you know what? This is done on the commercial side, but we like it so much, it's working so well for us. For our transactions that occur on the retail side, we're going to monitor it through the blockchain vis-a-vis the Fed coin or what have you.
Great question, and let me address a few of the major problems that the central banks currently face, along with the Bank of International Settlements, the IMF, the World Bank. They're all looking at how to solve these, if they're even solvable. Let me also address another key topic, and that is the influence that the Davos elite has on policy in general. Davos has never been in a less important status. Most governments do not care what's going on in Davos, and most prime ministers do not follow the agenda of the elites. And the public is fed up with Davos and with globalization in general. And obviously, the US public is what moves the needle across the world. So I just want to say that in general, the tides are really changing. You don't see many Americans supporting globalization. You just don't. Even the people that used to support it now understand the price that they're paying when they allow the government to mortgage their kids and grandkids and great-great-grandkids to police the world and to sail the oceans with the fleet and basically bring cheap oil from the Middle East into the US via the petrodollar system. And it's really important for someone that just watches this kind of interview to understand that in real life, many leaders just do not care about what's going on in Davos. They couldn't care less. They're not influenced by it. Their think tanks are not influenced by it. They are done listening to the globalist American way of life. So that's really important to really understand that, because that's been driving politics for many years. But ever since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, globalization should have basically ended. The agenda of globalization was to have the Western Bloc defeat the Eastern one. And once that was done, it was pure greed that continued American globalization into Iraq and Libya and everywhere else. It should have stopped, and that's why you saw so many generations of Americans saying, why are we here? What are we doing here? What's the point of this? Why are we in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and everywhere else? And in this interventionism is really now also coming into the mainstream in terms of the deficit spending that it brings. Because if the defense budgets now will cut into Medicare or Medicaid or education or anything else, and it is starting to affect because of high interest rates, then you will see the 2024 elections, which you've asked about, you will see them talking way more about the unsustainability of the national debt, a topic that has been pushed aside and pushed aside and pushed aside, and we now see with a debt ceiling that it will come back into the fold. The central banks, when they look at digital currencies and when they look at this ESG compliance, this all starts to break because it's not realistic. Because in a world that we're entering in, where globalization is not the mother trend, you cannot enforce ESG compliance on 3 to 4 billion people that's not their main agenda in the way that they live. These are all pipe dreams, and they will not be implemented. The world is moving back into the realistic stuff. First of all, realistic interest rates, realistic borrowing costs, and realistic deficits. These are all components that you will start hearing from all governments. Secondly, you have a huge trend of mass retirement in the Western world, and you have a demographic cliff in China. These are all going to put a lot of constraints on the tax revenues that governments will be able to collect, because the working class, meaning the demographics that are between the 25 and 65 cohorts, especially the 55 to 65, they're going to mass retire. When you mass retire, you take those stocks and you take those real estate investments and you move them into bonds and cash. That will take a lot of money out of circulation, and that will lower the tax revenues for America and for Europe. And in China, because of 340 million abortions during the one-child policies, you are now in a situation where there are so many Chinese women that just do not want to have children. They grew up on the one-child policy, and as you know, the average Chinese family has 1.05 children on average, even lower than Western Europe, where they like pets more than children. If you look at all of these trends, these Davos illusions are just not realistic, and that's not where the world is going towards. And if you look at the implementation of CBDCs, you face three major problems. One is what we call run on the banks at the government level, because today central banks control foreign currency reserves. If you let central bank digital currencies free flow to the public, imagine if you live in Venezuela or in other countries where their currencies are completely unstable. And now you can access, like this, you can access a US currency where you don't have any problem using the blockchain accessing US currency. Imagine how much trouble and how volatile global currency reserves can get if other nations can get access to the US dollar or to the euros or to the more stable fiat currencies. It creates incredible outflows and inflows that today we don't have to deal with. So these are problems that the central banks now face on how to control the flow of their currencies. And so it's not that easy as people think. Secondly, no central bank wants to replace physical cash or paper cash with digital currencies, because what you saw in Sweden and other countries is that when there are problems right across the border in Russia, etc., people run immediately to the ATMs, and you don't want people run to the ATMs and there are no paper cash to be had. When you look at how you really implement this, it's incredibly problematic, and that's why I'm telling you it will be very slow and will face a lot of public backlash. For now, I just don't see it really happening, and it will be really slow. Now, in countries like China, where you can just tell the public what's going to happen and then it's happening, it's another story. But in countries where you have way more free speech and what the public wants, it can influence, it will be much slower. That's the long short of it. Now, another surprise element I would say is what's called SDRs. I don't know if how in-depth you went into that topic on your channel, but just know that there is another form of global currency that could be introduced.
Special drawing rights, right?
Correct. So for anyone who doesn't know what it is, you can go to wealthresearchgroup.com/SDR and understand more about this topic. But it's a topic that you should know at the very least. These changes that we're talking about just usually do not happen before a major crisis invites them. You don't try to change and create major changes and disruptions to a country that's mostly functioning. And that's why I really think that the trade-off between the current system, at least in the West, and introducing and rolling out a new system, as controversial as a digital currency tied to ESG compliance, you know what will happen in the streets of America if that is even talked about in any major way. It will just not fly. And I don't think that any political leader has enough support to roll it out. Certainly not clowns like like Klaus Schwab and his group of academics, which most people do not care about.
Well, let's sum up everything with how all of this will tie into with gold and silver this year in 2023. For gold and silver, with everything we've talked about up to this point, how will that affect gold and silver this year?
If you look at the interest rate hikes that we've already seen, they've been unprecedented. Even Paul Volcker, when he came into office, interest rates were 10, and he raised them overnight to 20, which was a lot, but in relative terms, he doubled interest rates. And what Powell did was take interest rates from 0 to over 4.5, which is way more than doubling it. It's doubling it like every other month. The disruption to interest rate sensitive industries has been astronomical. In 2008, the equity loss from the subprime mortgage and the meltdown in markets was $20 trillion. In 2022, the equity loss was $35 trillion. That's almost double 2008. And the big difference between 2008 and 2022 was that 2008 was accompanied by massive layoffs, where we got to 15% unemployment in the United States at the peak. And 2022 was not a massive recession, but a massive reset. It was just a reset of valuations because of interest rates. And so what we're seeing in 2023 is the end of that reset period for equities, housing, and bonds, and how it gets transferred into the real economy with layoffs and slowing down of the housing sector. When you look at where the yield curve has reached and where interest rates are, every time we've seen this in the past where real interest rates were this positive, once they peaked, and I think that the peak will come around May or June with probably the last rate hike that we'll see in the cycle. I think that the price of gold and silver from that point on has a real shot for gold of hitting over 2,000 an ounce even during 2023. I think that it's very plausible that we will actually hit new all-time highs for gold in 2023 at some point. And for silver, I think that there's a real chance we will start touching the high 29s, lower 30s once this happens. Because when the Fed says that's it for interest rate hikes, I think that will fundamentally change where interest rates are going, and the trend will be lower, obviously, right? Because if they're not going higher, they're either staying put or going lower. And that has historically created bull markets for precious metals, especially when the economy is very slow and the need to hedge for this whipsaw inflation is greater than ever before. So with all of that, I think that the marriage of a dollar bear market, which is something we're seeing, the mass retirement of baby boomers, which need to keep selling their equities, and it's going to put a roof or a ceiling over the price of stocks because the inflows are going to be way lower than the outflows. That whole thing, that whole complex creates a need to hedge with gold and silver. Globally, only 0.5% of assets are devoted into precious metals. In 2011, at the peak, it was 0.85%. And so if you don't think that less than 1% of the world's asset universe going into gold is plausible, I beg to differ. And I think it is possible, and it could send gold to 2,100 and higher. And I wouldn't be surprised if the move in general to going into 2024 will take gold to 2,300. And comparatively, I think it can take silver to the mid 30s and even towards the 40.
That's very close to my forecast for gold and silver this year as well. Lior, this has been an enlightening conversation. Thank you for spending time with us here and telling us a little bit about what's going on in the world. a lot happening, and a lot of volatility for
Yeah.
sure. And so thank you so much. I want to extend a multitude of gratitude to you and to everyone for taking the time to watch. And we're encouraging you to please rate, share, comment, and subscribe.